So this is part 7 of Why Nations Fail. Let me quickly share this slide and then we will continue our discussion. Okay, so we are starting with slide 24, which discusses the virtuous circle in the Britain, and it's about the persistence. So how inclusive institutions basically reinforce themselves is the part of discussion over here. And we are turning to our question of persistence, which is one of the most important and I would say one of the most sobering aspects of this theory as well. The author basically talks about two kinds of persistence. One is the virtuous circle, and the other one is the vicious circle. He says that the virtuous circle is for the inclusive growth, and the vicious circle is for the extractive one. So, this slide basically focuses on the virtuous circle of how inclusive institutions in Britain kept becoming more and more inclusive over the time. You talk about modern world inequality, which is heavily influenced by the nature of institutions from the last 250 years. I know this is a very striking claim, but it means that the choices made or the forces that shape institutions during the Industrial Revolution era are still fundamentally structuring the fact that who is the rich and who is the poor even today. So why such persistence? Because there are powerful self-enforcing mechanism, both in inclusive as well as in extractive institutions. So for inclusive institutions in particular, the virtuous circle would work like this, like you have inclusive political institutions, it will lead towards inclusive economic institutions, having higher property rights, having free market systems, rule of law. Inclusive economic institutions would generate both the broad-based wealth, and broad-based wealth means that there is large, prosperous middle class with an interest in maintaining the institutions that would generate their prosperity. So the middle class has the resources and the organization to participate in the politics, to fund newspapers, to support independent courts, to vote out for the government that has threatened the property rights. And that political participation basically maintains and extends the inclusive political institutions. So, round and round, each element is basically reinforcing each other. When you talk about the British case, which is the Reforms Act, this actually shows this graph on your screen basically shows the violent, contentious gathering in Britain from 1828 to 1832. So what was happening basically, the new industrial cities of Britain, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds had no parliamentary representation whatsoever. Um, so this was a fundamental mismatch between the actual distribution of wealth and the population and the political institutions. The industrial middle class, which were the factory owners, the merchants, or the professionals of the new industrial cities, you can say, were more organized and mobilized for a reform. The graph shows that the level of contentious actions, such as demonstrations, riots, meetings, were happening. So in 1831, the spike that you can see over here is when a reform bill was passed, and this reform bill passed the Commons but was rejected by the Lords. So there were, riots across England. So in that scenarios, what did the political establishment do? They could have crushed the movement because they had the army, they had the courts, but instead, facing the alternative of revolution, they chose to compromise. The Reform Act of 1832, which extended the franchise significantly, redistributed seats from the Roton boroughs to the industrial cities, and brought a significant portion of the middle class into the political nation. So, this is the virtuous circle in action. The inclusive political institution that existed, such as free press, independent judiciary, A parliament that is genuinely had the power gave reformers the legitimate channel to push for the change. The reformers used those channels effectively, and the existing elite, being themselves constrained by the rule of law and fearing worse outcomes, chose to accommodate rather than crush. So, why Pakistan circles have been vicious uh, and not virtuous? Because there could be many reasons. Pakistan's institution dynamics have worked entirely in the opposite direction. When there's popular mobilization for reform, such as there's lawyers movement, there's political protest, or could be something like from the farmer side, the response has often been repression, some kind of intervention, or legal manipulations. The channels for legitimate institutional change have been repeatedly blocked or cultured. So the result is that the Pakistani institutions have drifted towards concentration of power. So the result is that the Pakistani institutions have drifted towards concentration of power, not away from it. So over the 78 years since independence, um, we have seen many kind of interventions. We have seen that democracy was often challenged as well. So breaking this pattern requires creating conditions for a virtuous circle to start. But the very institution needed to create those conditions are the ones being blocked by those who benefit from the current arrangement. So, this is the fundamental dilemma of development in countries those of um, such as Pakistan. Let's talk about the persistence. In the US South, because how extractive institutions survive even when there is a revolutionary change. After a revolutionary change, there's still persistence of vicious circle. So basically, this slide and the next slide will together tell you one of the most important and the instructive stories in the book, that how the most powerful military force in the 19th century, the American, could not fundamentally change the institutional structure of the American South. The lesson is sobering and deeply relevant for anyone who is thinking about the institutional change. So, in the antebellum, antebellum South, which is a classic extractive economy example, we are going to start with this example. The American South before the Civil War was a textbook example for an extractive economy. The plantation system, which was built on slavery, organized the entire social, economic, and political life of the South around the extraction of labor and value from enslaved African Americans for the benefit of a white planter class. So, economically, the South was poorer than the North, and about 70% of the Northern GDP per capita uh, were towards the North side. So, why? Because the plantation system, despite being profitable for the planters, were deeply inefficient in aggregate. So, enslaved workers basically had no incentives to be productive, to innovate, to develop skills beyond that what was required. So, the planter class, which secure in the monopoly on land and labor, had no competitive pressure to innovate either. Manufacturing was minimal, urbanization was low, infrastructure was sparse, railroads and canals were much less developed than in the north. So the planter class basically blocked industrialization for the same reason as the Russian, the Tsars, and Australian emperors did. And because of industrialization, it would have created an urban working class and middle class with independent economic power and different political interest. The Civil War, which is a massive critical juncture in the history, happened in 1861 to 1865, which was catastrophic. And it was a transformative event because over 600,000 Americans died. The South was physically devastated, and at the end, three constitutional amendments were passed: the 13th Amendment abolishing the slavery, the 14th Amendment, which was granting the citizens um, and equal protection to the formerly enslaved people, the 15th Amendment, which was giving black men the right to vote. So during Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, federal troops occupied the South and black men voted. Black men were elected to state legislature and Congress. So there were black lieutenant governors and black senators. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to motivate education and economic support to formerly enslaved people, and it seemed for a moment like a genuine institutional transformation has happened. But what actually happened was the vicious circle reasserts them itself. The Reconstruction actually ended in 1877 when the feudal troops were withdrawn as a part of political compromise. So the old planter elite reasserted control with remarkable speed. So what they did specifically was that they blocked the land redistribution. The promise of 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves which would have given them economic independence was never fulfilled. So without land, formerly enslaved people had to work for their former masters, now as sharecroppers. So the economic dependence continued and just under a different legal form, you can say. Um, you can even say that there was a disenfranchise of the black voters. So through poll taxes, literacy tests administered discriminatorily, grandfather clauses, and outright terrorism. The Triple K and other groups used violence to prevent black people from voting. By 1900s, black voters registration in the South has fallen from hundreds of thousands to almost zero in many states. Legal coercion even continued. Black codes and certain laws meant that unemployed black men could be arrested and their labor contracted out, essentially a legal form of forced labor after slavery was formally abolished. So, what was the result? The result was that the South remained a low wage, labor intensive, low education, and repressive economy for another century. And until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s finally broke the equilibrium, the specific institution of slavery was gone. But the underlying redistribution of political and economic power had not formally changed. The planter class adapted its tool, legal coercion replacing the chattel slavery, but the outcome for the mass of the black people or black population was horrifyingly similar. This is perhaps the most important lesson for Pakistan as well, because think about the history of attempted reforms in Pakistan. Land reforms were announced under Ayub Khan, under Bhutto. Bonded labor was formally abolished. Women right legislation has been passed. Child labor laws still exist on the books. But underlying the distribution of power has not fundamentally changed. The feudal landlords who cannot, formally practice the bonded labor, find legal ways to maintain the debt bondage. The laws against child labor still exist, but the labor inspector who is supposed to enforce them depends on the local politician for the posting. And the local politician depends on the Brooklyn owner for votes and money. So specific institutions change, laws are passed, constitutional amendments are made, but the underlying power structure adapts. So new tools, same outcomes. This is the vicious circle of the extractive institutions and is deeply entrenched in Pakistan's political economy. The lessons from the American South is that even 13 years of military occupation and the constitutional revolution couldn't break it. What eventually broke it was sustained mass political mobilization, the civil rights movement, which was combined with the federal intervention and crucially the economic changes that were undermining the old plantation economies uh, in a more logical way. So, change requires changing the underlying power structures and not just the formal institutions that sit on top of it. So, why nations fail today? This slide moves us from the historical example to the contemporary world, showing that extractive institutions are not a relic of the past but a living, functional reality that continues to affect billions of people today. The form would vary from comic to tragic, but the logic is always the same. Now let's talk about this. He is Robert Mugambi, who has who is the Zimbabwean president. So the BBC headlines tells the story very beautifully. President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe won the top prize in lottery organized by a party state-owned bank. His explanation, his name was simply drawn from thousands of customers. What are the odds? Well, when you control the state-owned bank, the judiciary, and there is no independent press or accountable mechanism that can do anything about it, the odds are surprisingly favorable. So, this is extractive institutions in their most brazen, least subtle form. But don't be distracted by the lottery system. The real story of Zimbabwe is far darker. Mugambe's Zimbabwe saw hyperinflation reaching to around 89.7%, which is one of the highest ever recorded in the human history. The Zimbabwe dollar became literally worthless in those times. People needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy the bread. Agricultural collapse. So Mugabe is a violent seizure of white owned commercial farms, which theoretically should have been a redistributive reform, was distributed not to poor black farmers who needed the land, but primarily to Mugabe's uh, and political and military allies, I would say. So most of whom had no farming experience. So agriculture output collapsed dramatically too. So a country that had been net food exporter become dependent on food aid. There was systematic looting of state resources as well through procurement corruption, through state enterprise capture, and through country manipulation as well. And yet, Mugabe ruled for 37 years. So he stayed in power till 2017 when his own military removed him, thankfully, maybe for that country, which is not a popular revolution, not a democratic election, but an internal coup within the extractive elite itself. Um, If you want to relate it to Pakistan, think about the public sector enterprises, PIA, Pakistan steel mills, electricity distribution companies, consistently losing billions of rupees annually, staffed with political appointees, and unable to compete. They are drained by corruption and mismanagement. And they are not failed businesses, rather, they are unsuccessful extractive mechanisms which are providing jobs, contracts, and resources to those with political connections and at the expense of tax-paying public. Okay, so in screen I have shown you the Pact of Santa Fe, the Relito, sorry, I cannot pronounce the name so correctly, but we can say the Pact of Santa Fe. So, this document is an extraordinary evidence of how extractive institutions work at the most explicit level. So, this was signed in 2001 and it is a formal agreement between Colombian parliamentary commanders Don Burma and George Forty. Here is the George Forty, and this is the Don Burma. Um, and Don Burma and George Forty controlled the trafficking and political violence across large parts of Colombia, and elected politicians, governors, members of Congress, and um senators as well. So they explicitly agreed to work together to refound the country, meaning to restructure the Colombian state in a way that benefited their criminal political alliance. Politicians would provide legal cover and legislative support. Parliamentaries would provide territorial control, intimidation of opponents, and elimination of rivals. So this is the explicit fusion of de facto and de jure power. Illegal coercive power and formal legal authority, which is combining to create an extractive system that captured the state itself. And it was only discovered when the parliamentarians demobilized under a peace process and the documents came to light. So many of the politicians who signed the pact were eventually convicted. But the underlying network and relationships proved far more durable than individual prosecutions. So in Pakistan, we do not have signed documents like of this, or if we do, they haven't come to any light yet. But the structured relationships between criminal network, real estate mafias, and political figures in major cities are well documented by journalists and researchers. The land mafias in cities like Karachi and Lahore does not operate without political protection. The exhaustive system in major cities have had connections to the political parties, so the form is different, but logic is identical. So, labor creation in Uzbekistan, we can discuss about it, but I believe that let's take a break here and we should end our this week's uh, lessons from Why Nation Fail. And in the next week, we would probably cover the last portion of this book as well, of Why Nations Fail, using the MIT original slides of Acemoglu. Thank you.